Welcome to the Let's Talk Politics Alabama podcast with your host, Daniel Stover and Russ Sanders, where we take a look at Alabama politics like a drive down I-65 from North Alabama to the state capital in Montgomery and all the way to the Sugar Sand Coast.
I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I am not going to exploit, for political purposes, my opponent's youth and inexperience.
All right, guys, how are we today?
Good.
Good to see Proncy back with us. It's a heavily House and state episode that we're going to do tonight. We're going to talk about what's going on with people that are not running for re-election or running for re-election, the leadership that is retiring, and then we're going to get off into a little bit of prison reform that, Miss Kay tried to take and almost pull a fast one on everybody. So we'll talk about that a little bit. But first, we're going to start off with there's a story on AL.com that came out on the 25th of this month, and it talks about the representatives, both Republican and Democrat, that are going to run for re-election. All 105 seats are up for election this time. And right now, 59 of 77 Republicans have said they're going to run for re-election or plan to do so, and 23 of 27 Democrats have said that. Just a little note here. There are several that we know are not going to run for re-election, one being Republican Representative Wes Allen from Troy. He's going to be running for Secretary of State. Over in Madison County, our good friend Mike Ball, he is going to retire after serving since 2002. And let's see. We've got Representative Andrew Sorrell, who covers part of Lawrence County and the Muscle Shoals area, who's finishing up his first term, who's going to run for state auditor. And then one that I love hearing, because I'm a firm believer in term limits, is Representative Rich Wingo of Tuscaloosa has said that he's served since 2014, and because he believes in term limits, he's not running again. So I guess that brings us to the leadership, and Mac McCutcheon is going to retire. Proncy, what's that going to do to us down there?
Well, it'll be a significant change. As you know, the Speaker of the House is a very prominent position. It is elected by the other House members. It's an elected official. It's an elected position among us. So what happens is that once, after the election's over in November, usually by the first week in December, we do what's called an organizational session. And during that session, we elect Speaker of the House, the Majority Leader, the Vice Majority Leader, as well as Speaker Pro Tem. And each of those positions are put in place. Then the Speaker makes the appointments throughout the House. In other words, each of the standing committees, and I think there are about 22 standing committees, the Speaker picks or chooses and appoints the chairman, and the vice chairman, and the minority leader for each of those standing committees. He also sets the assignments then for every House member of what committees you're on. So as you can see, that's a very powerful position. And there could be major changes with a new speaker, depending on who that is. Right now, the two people who are candidates for the speaker seat are current Majority Leader Nathaniel Ledbetter and the chairman of the General Fund Committee, which is Steve Klaus. So there could be other people enter the race. We're still a long way from December of 2022 when we do that organizational meeting. But um, meanwhile, the speaker will stay in his position through the next session, and I'm sure there will be a lot of discussion and consideration for who that next leader is over the next year.
So, no chance of hearing Proncy Robertson on that list now, huh?
Well, I could run for it. It's not a necessarily about how long you've been in the House. Every representative in the House of Representative has the opportunity. I could candidate among the other representatives and campaign, if you will, just like they are, and try to get elected to one of those positions. At the moment, I'm not considering that. Um, I think that I'm still finding my way, if you will, building relationships, and who knows? If one of these days, it might be something to consider, one of those leadership positions. But I'm just not bold enough to say, yeah, I'm ready to be Speaker of the House and to try to run for that or anything right now.
Well, everybody, you heard it here. Proncy is not going to run as of right now for Speaker of the House. So, one day that I saw in this story that had come up for that position also was Connie Rowe of Jasper. I don't think that was one of them that you had mentioned, but now.
Representative Rowe is you remember I mentioned the majority leader is Nathaniel Ledbetter. She is the vice majority leader or deputy majority leader. In other words, she's second in charge to him. So, and she holds a seat on the very powerful Rules Committee as well. She said, I think Connie's been there at least since 2010. So about 11, 12 years of seniority. She does an excellent job, and since that a lot of people have a lot of respect for her, and so I could see her throwing her name in the hat as well.
So is this leadership change, is that going to maybe slow things down in the House, or do you see this possibly speeding up? What's kind of the feeling there?
Well, I don't think slow things down at all. Anytime you have a change in leadership that is that drastic, again, the Speaker is a very powerful position, and who knows, the new Speaker may leave a lot of those chairmanships where they're at and not make a major shift. But on the other hand, they could make a lot of changes. And so we'll just have to see how that plays out. And as you can imagine, all those positions are on the table, depending on who the new leader is. So we'll just have to see how it shakes out. I don't think it will slow anything down. There are very capable people there who have a lot of experience. And, even from my 3 years down there now going on 4, you have a lot thrown at you real fast. And you learn how the process works and build relationships. And so anyone who starts to move up into those positions, I think, will fill the gaps pretty quickly.
All right. Well, Russ, you look like you're sitting on the edge of your seat over there. You got any questions for Proncy on that one?
I think you had mentioned that it was Wes Allen that was running for Secretary of State that wasn't running again, correct?
Right.
The reason why Andrew Sherrill's not running is he's running for state auditor. I'm not sure we said that in the opening there.
Yeah, he's running for state auditor, and like you said, Wes Allen's running for Secretary of State. We've had Wes Allen come to our Republican meeting already. Not sure when Andrew will make it up there. I'm sure that we're on his list somewhere. Mm-hmm. I would hope so at least, but who knows? We might even get him on our podcast here. So, all right. Well, let's that didn't go as long as I thought it would, so let's move on over to something that's I guess has got to have a little bit of history here. Proncy. I know this started well before you were actually in office, I believe. And it's been an issue for a long time, but the state of Alabama's prisons, with overcrowding and everything, Miss Kay seemed to have developed a plan that I thought actually sounded pretty good. It's the reason we're calling this one 33 Years to Life as a title here. But, it seems like we had a plan in place that we were going to let somebody else foot the bill for the prisons, and that we were just going to lease them from them. And in 33 years, if they weren't up to snuff, then we walked away and we got somebody else to rebuild. Seemed like a good idea. I mean, to me, from a financial standpoint, you can kind of clue us in on the how she pulled this off, even getting this deal to the table without having to go through the House and Senate. But you had told me, too, there's a little bit of history here that we've got to go back a few years to not only just when the federal government came in and said, hey, your prisons you got to do something about, but we've been working on this for a while, hadn't we?
Yes. Probably at least a decade that, the issues really began to come to light, and there was a lot of concern about the conditions and some issues going on inside our prisons. So that generated from a lot of complaints from inmates, their families, lots of people that were seeing issues there. And those turned into some pretty large lawsuits that eventually got before the courts and before the federal court. And probably the first thing that came up was back, I think 2012 or 13, when there was some concerns over the women's prison at Tutwiler and the conditions there. And there was a number of things that the state did at that time, working with the federal government, and specifically Judge Thompson, the federal judge Thompson in Birmingham. I'm trying to remember his first name at the moment, but Judge Thompson made some pretty strict rulings about some things that needed to be done to straighten out those issues. And the state worked hard to correct those and actually got some better reports from the women's side of the prison. Meanwhile, there was the same kind of issues and or worse going on in the men's prisons. And again, that worked its way through the courts until we're up to a federal level. And Judge Thompson began to put some guidelines in place, some things that he was requiring us to do, or under the threat that DOJ would be ordered to come in basically and take over control of our prisons. That has happened to some other states for similar conditions and or overcrowding. At one point, they were saying that our prisons were somewhere around 160% capacity. So that tells you, to give you some idea of what I'm talking about, we are slotted in Alabama. When I say slotted, the federal courts have said they tell each state, based on the population you have, they estimate the number of prison beds that you should have. And now you can argue about whether that's right or wrong or whatever, but Alabama's somewhere around that 16,000 prisoner mark is what we're supposed to be, they say, based on our population of what was just under 5 million people. So they said you shouldn't have more than that many people incarcerated. If you do, then we're going to pressure you as a state to find ways to keep those numbers down. So that's more difficult than it sounds. When you say, well, okay, we got 16,000 beds. We have somewhere around currently somewhere around 22 to 24,000 prisoners for those 16,000 beds. So the judge said a couple of things. Number one, you need to reduce your numbers. He wanted to see that percentage of 160 or whatever it was come down. It's my understanding that is somewhere around 135% currently. So we've done a number of things to try to change that over the last decade. On top of that, he said, you do not have enough prison guards to handle those numbers of prisoners. And I think the number he put out on us a couple of years ago was that we had 3 years to hire 2,500 more prison or correction officers. I know Russ has got some experience with police departments and trying to hire police officers. Well, it's very similar trying to hire corrections officers. It's not as easy as it sounds to find people who can meet the minimum requirements, pass a background check, the drug screens, and polygraphs, things like that, that you can have trustworthy as possible employees in there working among prisoners. If you just hire anybody that wants a job, you can imagine the problems you may encounter with putting folks like that working in a state prison. So that's become an issue. The state we have budgeted millions more each year to try to hire more, to do it faster, more efficiently, and to bring those numbers up. And at the same time, to put a lot of money into improving those older buildings. Now, some of those prison buildings, and when I say some of them, how many prisons you think we have in Alabama? Either one of y'all got a guess? Or how many facilities?
It's
I know
over
of one.
10. It's over 10 or 12.
We'll guess 15.
Over 10 or 12. What about you, Daddy? The straightest answer I've been able to get, and it's harder to get DOC to tell you than you think, it's somewhere between 22 and 24 different facilities that we hold prisoners in, all across the state of Alabama. Most of those are 40, 50, 60 years old. You can just imagine a school building that old and the wear and tear and the deterioration. Well, imagine a prison that's that old. They crumble, they break, the plumbing wasn't what it just wasn't meant to handle that capacity of people when it was built. Wasn't meant to handle 140% capacity. The electrical work after that time goes bad. Lots of things break every day. And the state is spending millions, estimated somewhere around $85 to $90 million a year that we budget for maintenance cost alone at the prisons, at those 22, 24 facilities. So when Governor Bentley was in there with all these issues going on, we need to hire guards, we need to do things. And let me emphasize this. Those 24 facilities were not designed to do anything other than to house people. They weren't set up for rehabilitation, if you will, such as teaching these guys and gals that are in prison a trade, or teaching them college courses that they could get, or even simple as a GED. They're not designed for that. Now, over the years, we've done things to try to add on a little wing or modify a wing so that you could do some of those things. But as you can imagine, it's very difficult. And so a lot of even that kind of training has been co-opted out, even where they take prisoners off-site to get maybe shop training or electrician training, that kind of thing that they may be offering them. But you can imagine the manpower, the complications that causes also. The other issue is that with 22, 24 facilities across the state, the medical and mental health issues that we deal with in the prisons, the older prisoners that you deal with their health concerns, you have to have some type of infirmary or a plan to get them to and from medical treatment, regardless of the facility. Some of them have their own hospital basically, and some of them they have to have some sort of external contract. Those things are very costly. So the population has changed in these prisons as well. When we're talking even 30, 40 years ago, about 70% of the prisoners in there were nonviolent offenders, burglars, petty theft, drug charges, those kind of things. That now, when we look at the numbers, has flipped because of some of the things I'm talking about we've done with sentencing reforms and changes we've made, some early release stuff. That's changed drastically. Now you have 70 to 80% of the prisoners in there that are violent, long-term offenders, repeat offenders that need to be in prison. People say, well, why don't you let go? All you guys are in there for marijuana. The last count they gave us, there was less than 3% of the current population that are in there on any type of marijuana charge. And anyone in state prison for a marijuana charge is there on a trafficking or above level. I'm talking about 2.2 pounds or distribution of a large quantity of marijuana. So there's nobody in there for having a joint or a small bag of weed.
Now,
Got a question, Dan?
does that 22 some odd facilities you said, and those facilities are holding our most violent criminals, does that include like the work release facility in Decatur?
That's a good question. I don't think when I say 22, 24 facilities that they are counting those work release centers.
Okay.
I'm talking about where they are locked down holding prisoners. So there are others. And that's why I say it's hard to get a good number from them about how many actual facilities we have that are holding prisoners, because you're right. There are intake facilities. There are work release centers, multiple things like that that are also out there online. So that all have to be manned and maintained and keep the lights and the power and the water and all that going. So it's a major, major expense. Okay, I said all that to say that there's some major issues there with the prisons, as you can tell. We do not want to get in a situation where the judge orders that DOJ takes over, because what happened in California when they were at 160% and DOJ took over is they immediately released somewhere around 50% of their prisoners. Just let them go. Okay.
Wow.
They had an out process, a rehearing. They did everything they could to reduce those numbers. And I'm sure that's what we would see happen here. We do not want to be in that position. So when Governor Ivey says this is an Alabama problem that we should solve in Alabama way, that's what she's talking about, is that we need to find an answer to this before the federal government does, because we are not going to like the way that goes. The other thing they will probably do is pretty much force us to build so many new facilities anyway. Facilities that meet the needs that I'm talking about, with medical, mental health facilities that are part of the new building, which would consolidate a lot of those things compared to how they're spread out now and save us some money. And they would force us to reduce the number of prisoners in each of those facilities. One of the interesting things that I've heard is when we talk about building new prisons, that 16,000 number I'm talking about, people say, well, why don't we build 3 new prisons and we spread them out, among those, and we keep the facilities open we've got? No. If we build new prisons, we cannot increase our number of beds. All right. So that's one of the orders from the judge. So if we build 3 prisons that have between them 10,000 beds, that means we have to close enough buildings that have 10,000 beds in them. All right. And move those folks into the new facility. So here's what happened. Governor Bentley started to try to take care of this with a bond issue. And at that time, they were looking at somewhere around $2 billion to build, it was 3 or 4 facilities. Excuse me. And that sounds good. He said these are new facilities that will house, it will consolidate all these different resources that we have out there for medical, mental health into those larger buildings. It will consolidate a lot of those places that have 300 or 400 prisoners into a larger building so that they can be controlled with more modern technology, as like locking the doors and so forth by like remotely, and have less guards that are needed because of the surveillance and so forth that would be in them, cameras and all that kind of thing. So major upgrade to say the least. So that was the plan. Comes to the legislature, and I think it was sometime in late 2017, before my day, and proposed that to the legislature to do a bond issue for those prisons. Now that may sound simple enough, but here's becomes the issue. If we had a facility, a prison facility here in Lawrence County that had a couple hundred prisoners, it would mean that it probably has a couple hundred jobs as well, local jobs. And that prison supplies and supports a lot of other businesses around, whether it be the hospital or the mental health services. There's food services. There are lots of things that would probably be tied to that facility that we would want to keep here. Much like when we lost IP, it hurt the county drastically because we lost that revenue that was there from all those property taxes, the income taxes that those employees are paying, and just having the jobs. So if we have to close, they're estimating if we build 3 to 4 prisons like that, we're going to need to close somewhere around, 10 to 14 other facilities, minimum. So the representatives in those districts who were about to lose those jobs and all that support in their communities, do you think they were all up in there to vote for that?
Absolutely not. Just like we wouldn't be.
That's right. So with that happening, they weren't interested in borrowing the money and losing jobs in their jurisdictions as well. So the bill failed, did not pass. We know what happened with Governor Bentley. He soon after left office, and Governor Ivey came in. Well, Governor Ivey was lieutenant governor presiding over the Senate when that bill was proposed by Governor Bentley and that plan. So she was adamantly familiar with it and what happened there and the history that I just told you. So she started thinking, how can we accomplish this without a vote of the legislature? Because I don't think I can get them to close 12, 14 facilities. Yet we're going to have to. And so here was her plan, and as simple as I can explain it. She said she has the power as the governor to enter into lease agreements with private companies. She can do that. She can only do those, though, for a year at a time. So she devised a plan. They put out what's called an RFP, or a request for proposal. And in that request for proposal, it said, we want companies to bid on building 3 prisons. These are the excuse me. These are the specs for those prisons. They have to be this size. They have to have these training facilities in them. They have to have these medical facilities in them. They have to have these mental health, room for the mental health folks. They had all these specific things that we wanted that prison to accomplish. And it has to have this many beds. The way they broke that out in the RFP is there would be 1 4,000 man prison and 2 3,000 person prisons. The 4,000 was meant to hold the older prisoners, mental health prisoners, which require a lot of extra care, and or sick, those, some prisoners in there that are terminally ill, so, or have some kind of other pretty serious medical conditions. So the larger of those would have housed the major medical facility as well, so that those prisoners, you didn't have the cost of transporting them everywhere else and all that. So she wanted one like that, and then two of the other prisons, which were designed to do some of these trainings to keep recidivism down. In other words, you train them, you teach them a trade, get their education up, so when they go back into society, that they're able to function as normal citizens and not come back again. So there was a method to the madness in building 3 new ones. But with that, you still have the problem that you've got to get legislators to vote to close their current facilities. Plus, a lot of them would be who understand what a benefit that a prison is to their jurisdiction, that's that size. For instance, that 400-man prison, you'd be looking at somewhere around 1,000 employees. And the 2 smaller ones, 800, 850 employees at that one facility. That's like IP coming to your county. So you can see where a lot of legislators wanted to get that in their jurisdiction as well. So to prevent that argument over in the House and in the Senate and those battles that she knew she would face, like Bentley did, she said, I will put out an RFP, and agree to lease those 3 buildings. Now, a lot of people keep calling this plan of hers that we're privatizing the prison system. It wasn't doing that at all, okay? And if you said that, you just don't understand what she's doing. She was asking private companies to build the buildings, and if they would build them to our specs or her specifications, then we would lease the buildings back from them. And the cost of that was approximately the first number we heard was somewhere around $85 to $87 million a year for that lease contract. Now, you remember what I told you the maintenance cost was on those other facilities?
About 90.
Mm-hmm. So we could, if we closed down those old facilities, and by the way, in the RFP, it says that the company who's building these new ones would pick the new sites, and they would do it in such a way that corresponds with the oldest facilities that would need to be closed. So in essence, she wouldn't have to ask any of us which prisons were closed and which ones would open. And we would save the maintenance costs. It would pay for, well, this is the theory, and that the maintenance costs would pay for the 3 new buildings. So she was not going to have to come to us and ask for a dime. They would just simply take the maintenance costs that we're already appropriating every year and pay the new lease payment. And she would re-up the lease once a year to keep paying it. So that was her plan. The problem was that obviously there's some pushback about that and some concern from many, many legislators who didn't either have a lot of the full story that I just told you there, a lot of the understanding of it, and or they just didn't like it, didn't think that we should be leasing buildings, or that we should be letting private companies make the decision about where these changes are made from county to county. So you can see where legislators were not very excited about this plan. But the governor, frankly, was literally saying she didn't need us. She could do it without us. Well, one problem.
That all boiled down to because she was going to spend the money that was going to be spent to begin with.
That's right. There was one problem. She has to come up with some upfront financing, which is, or not her, but the private companies because you remember they're building the buildings up front. And so they would be in essence fronting that $2 to $3 billion. And so to do that, the companies would need to take out loans. They were unable to obtain the financing. Therefore, the deal collapsed is what it amounted to, because there was a timeline to get all this done by. And if I remember right, it was June 1st of this year, and
I believe so.
it did not happen.
Yeah, I believe you're right on that date.
So, yep. So what's happening now is right near the end of it, when it was all kind of coming to a head, legislature, we had several meetings and discussions among the majority caucus and leadership about how we could do this better, how there could be a bond issue, much like Governor Bentley proposed, that would pay for state-owned facilities. Now, when I said a while ago she's not privatizing them, remember, she was just hiring the company, if you will, to build the buildings and then leasing from them, and they would be responsible for all those maintenance costs for 30 years as well. The employees that were there and the everyday operation would be state employees. In other words, Department of Corrections, as those other facilities closed, they would just move into the new facilities. They were still state-run, state-operated by DOC, just like the facilities are today. It's just that the building would be leased and not owned by the state. So that was her plan. Whether you agree with that or not, I mean, I understand both sides of it. I understand the reason why Governor Ivey proposed that. I also understand why the legislators believe that we can, especially with the bond rates right now. You remember we did a $2 billion bond for the schools for capital improvements year before last. And the bond rates are so good right now that we can borrow that money for almost nothing. And so it's almost interest free. I say it's very low. And so we believe that cost wise, having a bond issue and paying it back like you would making a loan would be much cheaper in the long run. And at the end of that or the bond in 20, 25, 30 years, we would own the buildings. Now, the difference is yes, there will still be, after the first decade or so, those maintenance costs start to come back. And you have to build and factor those things in as well. So right now, there's a lot of negotiating going on between House and Senate leadership with the governor's office and trying to make a new proposal that they can bring before the legislature this next session, and even talk, as you know, of a special session this fall to bring us back and to vote for a proposal that would build 3-4 new prisons through a bond issue. And so that's a pretty good overview of what's going on and what's happening with it. Did I miss anything, or y'all got questions about that?
I've got a few comments. So the legislature had to pass the Class D felony, which reduced the number of people in prison, and it put a lot of those people in county jails and things of that nature. So a lot of state inmates are in county jails. So where I'm going with this is everybody goes, well, let's just put them all in tents and spend that money on the schools. Well, the federal government's not going to let us do that. And these prisons being overcrowded and being in the condition they are causing or having a trickle down effect to communities. So people say,
That's
well, why, the police, all they're doing is locking them up and letting them right back out. Well, people are entitled to a bond. Then you go through the trouble of getting somebody's bond revoked, and then they sit in jail for a while. Then they give them time served. Then they get off a time or two, and they get the Class D felony, and then they spend time in the county jail. Well, now they need a liver transplant or a kidney transplant, and you're talking about a lot of these people that normally would be in state prison or in our county jails, and it's costing the county commissions money, it's costing cities money, it's costing sheriff's office money. And then people say, well, the judge just needs to sentence them. Well, some of the judges' hands are tied too, because they can't send people to prison because they're overcrowded. So when those prisons are overcrowded, those people are back in your community, knocking on your door at 2 a.m., busting the window out of your car, breaking in, stealing stuff to buy dope. The police are in turn having to deal with them again. Then some of them have mental illness because they can't stay in the state prison and deal with the mental illness, and the cycle just repeats itself. So the prisons being overcrowded and underfunded, poor conditions, and things of that nature are directly affecting your quality of life at your home on your own property in the most generalist of terms. And they was talking about
You're absolutely right.
nobody wants to be a prison guard, nobody wants to be a police officer, nobody wants to do any of that stuff because you have to deal. Why would you go to a dangerous prison, deal with people that live there who constantly are thinking about ways to hurt you or get out for a low pay rate when you can go to a fast food joint or something of that nature and have a lot better benefits with a lot less stress? So people aren't beating down the doors to work in prisons and police and things like that.
Russ, a couple of other things that's kind of been spin-offs of this as well is over the last couple of years, we have put a lot of money into when you do some kind of sentencing reform, it affects someone else. It's like you said, if you change make it harder for someone to go to prison, they're still going to get in trouble. And so if it's at a lower rate of a crime, they end up, as you said, in the county jails, which puts more expense, more pressure on our sheriffs, the county commissions to pay for it. But the next piece of that is twofold. One is these new community corrections programs that we're really talking a lot about. And what that is, basically, it's when you have a pretty serious crime committed, but it's not a violent crime. They give the opportunity for the judge to sentence them into what it amounts to is an enhanced probation, where they pay their fines, they stay under more direct supervision of a local group, if you will, sometimes a private entity, but a lot of counties have created their own community corrections, which is basically a way to keep that person out of the prison system, keep us from going to 160% again, yet still supervise them because they are a lower risk to the public, if you will. And the next level of that is probation and parole. We've really added a lot of money, somewhere around, I think, I remember 27 million one year and maybe that much again the next year for parole and probation to expand their numbers because they have so many people that are getting out on early release, something called mandatory release, which is basically anybody who's in prison who is within 3 years of their end of sentence, they're automatically released. Okay. They automatically released. But what that means is they automatically go on to probation and parole. They may have an ankle monitor. They may have some kind of direct check-in, once a week, once a month, whatever that's set at by probation and parole. But they go under that system. So if we don't have corrections officers to hold them in prison and feed them and all those costs, then we certainly have the cost of probation and parole and or these local community corrections facilities and programs to help that with that halfway point, if you will. So it is a complicated issue that is constantly moving and shifting and will continue to do so. And, and behind all that is a federal judge saying you will get this done by this date. And so it's not about even the legislature wanting to let people go or to try to reduce the penalties for specific crimes, but it's trying to find the right balance to these things. And that's why I told you a while ago that population in the prisons has drastically shifted from 70% nonviolent, 30% violent, to right the opposite, where you're talking about 70 or 80% are violent, long-term offenders, ones we can't let out. They're class A and B felons that are there for a long time. And those that are down there in that 30% are those who just committed so many burglaries. They may not be a violent guy, but they've created so many issues for themselves that they have to serve some sort of period of time. The judge eventually has to put them in prison rather than one of these other programs.
But even the amount of people in some of those programs, you still have to hire people to supervise them. That's a really big number that I don't think people really have their heads wrapped around, on the amount of supervision time, uh, all that it takes to
Thousands.
manage a caseload, if you will. It's kind of it's hard to really scrutinize, and again, that affects that quality of life, in your community, because that probation officer, that community corrections officer, pretrial diversion, drug court officer, whatever program, they're not out 24/7, and then sometimes their hands are even tied on sending people back. But you was talking about the shift. I've even seen sex offenders not get sentenced to prison. And I'm not talking about a 16-year-old and a 15-year-old, or a 17-year-old and a 15-year-old. Some of your higher ups, sex offenses. Some of those aren't going to prison either, and it's just they're getting probation. So I think it's
Figure out alternative sentencing. Yep.
I think it's getting to a level where really something's going to have to be done, or people are really going to be shocked about what will happen as a result, what they see on the street day in and day out.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
We're kind of maxing out on time here for our podcast here, but one thing I just want to remind everybody of, all of those people that we're talking about that have to be hired, whether it's for the state or local level, that's all our tax dollars. You want to see where our tax dollars are going, right there. And right now in Lawrence County, correct me if I'm wrong, Russ, but I think the sheriff's only paying like maybe $13 an hour.
When I came off with a 4-year college degree, I started out at $13.28 an hour.
I mean,
I topped out at $16.76 an hour.
You can go to McDonald's and get that much, just about. I mean,
That's
McDonald's is, Lowe's, McDonald's. I mean, everybody's got hiring signs out right now, and heck, a lot of them are even paying bonuses to come to work at a fast food restaurant. When did you ever think you'd see that? But
I have one question for Bronson. I know a federal judge, there's been a lot of talk how judges have become legislatures, basically using their office to, cast stuff. Is there a way to appeal that 16,000 number? Can we appeal it where, like, if we build prisons that hold 20,000, what happens? Is there a way to appeal that process where we can ask for more beds? Is there anything that can be done in that regard?
Well, it's possible, and the Attorney General's office are constantly, the governor's office are constantly negotiating, if you will, with the DOJ and with that's the Department of Justice, and with those federal judges, and trying to find a balance to this stuff, to say, and you have, frankly, if you've got a very liberal judge, which is what we're dealing with in this circumstance, his opinion is that we just need to reduce the number in prison. We're too hard on crime, that we need to reduce the numbers. And so when he's that hard line, and he's, the federal judge, yes, there could be, once he makes a official ruling, okay, this is all still pending in the process and the negotiations, you understand. Mm-hmm. But there are some ways that if he ever made a hard, said, that's it, DOJ is in control. Sure, we could, the Attorney General could appeal that to a higher court and try to get him overturned. But frankly, that federal judge has a lot of say, and he's handling a lot of other similar cases in the district, and it's not very likely that he's going to get overruled. So it's in our best interest to try to find a balanced approach, to meet needs that he's asking us to try to get to a, for lack of a better word, some kind of compromise, to say, yes, we need another 4,000 beds. Let us come up to 20,000. And if you do that, we'll hire X number of guards, to control them. he's saying, but it's very likely that the judge would raise our number of beds when we're not getting the number of guards that he says we need for the current number, right? So it's just a never-ending circle there. And so we have to find smarter and more creative ideas to figure this problem out. And frankly, that's what the governor was trying to do. Whether you agree with her or not, you got to give her some kudos for saying, let me try something different. Because in a special session or in a regular session, we're going to be right back in that same position. I feel like that Governor Bentley was, and that legislative body, because when we start drilling down to, okay, which facilities are we closing? You're going to have that same, you don't have my vote.
Yep.
And if you don't get my vote, we don't get the bond issue, we don't get new prisons, and we're back in the argument with the judge. So it's a complicated, and y'all hear me say this from time to time, and hopefully this podcast has been an example of what I say when it's a complicated issue. It's easy to get on a podcast and say, by gosh, why don't they do this? There's a lot of reasons why. And not the least of which is getting 105 in the House and another 35 in the Senate to agree to a deal.
Well, I'm not trying to send us off another rabbit hole here, but, we saw how big of an issue that was just in the lottery bill that came up this past session with who's going to get a casino and who gets to keep their current illegal operations. Yeah. There's a lot of moving parts, y'all. But
we could do a whole nother podcast on why don't Pronti vote for why doesn't Pronti vote for a lottery? I've never got to vote for a lottery. I've not come any closer to it than you guys have. Okay. So it's not a matter of not voting for one. We hadn't even come to a bill that could be voted on yet. So yeah, if you want to talk about that, set your clock. We'll take the time to do it.
Well, we're gonna cut this one off for now, because I feel like we could probably go another. We've been going 52 minutes on this subject. I figure we could probably go at least that, just getting into the whole minutia of what could we actually do to fix the issue. But I feel we need to go ahead and cut it off because we're going to lose some people if we don't. But thank y'all for coming by and listening to us, listening to Pronti again. He's a great wealth of knowledge. Appreciate him being on with us. And, maybe this is giving you a perspective on why there was an issue with Kay Ivey's recommendation of leasing prisons. Honestly, I thought it was a pretty good idea. I understand there's some issues there, but, from the standpoint of the maintenance and everything, I'm kind of on board with her. But, there's a lot of people that aren't because they're going to lose those jobs in those areas. So, yeah, like you said, Pronti, I see it from both sides. But, all right. Well, if you're interested in sponsoring our podcast, please get with us. We'll be happy to hook you up on a deal there. Also, if you're listening to us on Facebook or Podbean, any of the podcast platforms, make sure to go over to YouTube and check out, because there is video with it. Give us a 5 stars on the podcast sites, and make sure you give us a thumbs up, a like on YouTube, and subscribe if you're liking what we're doing. We're just trying to be informative and get out there what's really going on the best that we know. So, all right, until next time, y'all got the last words.
Y'all be careful.
Daniel, I just want to say thank you to both of you for doing what you can to actually get good information out to people of Lawrence County and anyone else who's willing to listen and tune in to us. So thank y'all for what you're doing here. If I can ever be a help with one of these subjects, don't hesitate to call me. Thanks.
Thanks, Bronson. See y'all next time.